Hi everyone, welcome to week three. This week marks the beginning of the actual regional geography chapters, and we begin with North America. So, as I'll do every week for the weekly actual chapters on regions, I'll begin with a Google Earth presentation or sort of a tour, as it were. So, let's look at North America from a Google Earth perspective. So, North America in this book encompasses the United States and Canada, of course, including Alaska. When you focus in on North America and the United States first, you have some significant features in the Gulf of Mexico, which is what provides a lot of the moisture for a lot of the farming that takes place in the middle of the US, the Corn Belt and the Wheat Belt in the middle. You have the Atlantic Ocean. So you have two warm bodies of water, the reason why Florida has so much in the way of rainfall and thunderstorms. As you head about west of this line, you see how much browner it gets. These are the Rockies. The Rockies really begin down in Mexico, called the Sierras, and they move through New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and then you move into the Canadian Rockies through Alberta and British Columbia, and eventually the Northwest and Yukon territories. The West Coast is unique in that it has a cold ocean current to the west, meaning it's not as wet, it isn't as hot or cold uh, as, say, the East Coast of the United States can get because it has a warm ocean current along its border between the continent and the ocean. So the warm Gulf current here, cold current that basically comes from the Gulf of Alaska. So a significant difference in climate. In the West Coast, the climate is more seasonal. It is, if you look in the climate page in the chapter, it shows up as Mediterranean. And that's true of a city like San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all the way up to Seattle. You see that reflection, and that is a winter wet, summer dry um, pattern, which is why they rely so much on snowmelt from the Sierras or the Wasatch Range in Oregon and Washington for a lot of their rainfall because it fills up the reservoirs. When that doesn't happen, you end up having a worse than normal uh, fire season, which has been the case for quite a few years now, unfortunately. In the United States, you have the hottest place on earth, Death Valley in California, and this is below sea level, and temperatures here have been as high as 136 degrees. And that's not heat index, that's actual temperature. So this right here, if you ever get a chance, it's a very interesting place to go. In the United States, you also have Las Vegas, not that far from there. It's a bowl, a valley. And here you have, for example, Lake Mead, which is really, really low as far as water level right now. And then you have, of course, Las Vegas itself, which depends on water from um, Lake Mead in order to sort of sustain itself. Looking at it from a much larger scale, this is the Imperial Valley of California. This is water. So here's the Colorado River, which is dammed up about 15 times along its route. And if you zoom in and you look a little closer, you will see right about here there are water diversion channels that have been established. Notice how they take the water from the river and they divert it into this channel, that channel, and this channel. If you look up or look out rather, you see that that water is then channelized across the desert and then it is used to basically feed or water the Imperial Valley. This is where you get a lot of your fruits and vegetables in winter. This should not be green. It's a desert on either side, as you can see. So it's a very significant reinvention of the landscape to suit human needs. All right, so getting away from there and looking at Canada. Of course, here's the source of the majority of our cold weather in winter. Some of those air masses will form out in Nunavut or the Northwest Territories and then head south into southern Canada and the United States. And that is when our area gets its really, really cold winter weather, say January, February, December timeframe. Okay, that air is literally coming out of the Arctic Ocean. Um, of course, this whole region is essentially glacial in origin, and you can see that in the United States, here as close to New York City as the Hudson Valley. You see how this is full of lakes, and so this is part of the reason why there are so many little lakes and ponds throughout, like Orange County and Westchester, Putnam, Orange, Rockland, and beyond. It's a glaciated landscape. However, if you go even further north, the Adirondacks, the Great Lakes, and the Finger Lakes region of New York, of course, the five Great Lakes. And then if you look into Canada, it is literally filled with literally tens of thousands of lakes. And these lakes were gouged out by the ice as it moved over the area. And then when that ice melted, it created lots and lots of lakes. This whole area, Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. And in fact, these are the Great Lakes that we know. But notice there's a pretty big lake there, another big lake here in Manitoba, more Great Lakes in Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories. And way up here, there's an immense lake that rivals any lake in the Great Lakes region. And so all these are basically created by glaciation of a long time ago. In North America, the only area that still has glaciers would be, of course, British Columbia, higher terrain, and of course, as you head near the fjords of Alaska, near the coastline, these are still one of the few areas with actual glaciers that are not continental, meaning not Greenland or Antarctica. And if you head further north into the coast, so in other words, once you get away from this region, which is a belt of pine trees called the boreal forest or the taiga, you get into the tundra. So you go from a D climate to an E climate. And there you find, for example, the extreme northern shores of Alaska and Canada, which is where permafrost is still a thing, meaning the ground is permanently frozen about a couple of feet below the surface in summer. Obviously, in winter, it's frozen all the way through. So that's a bit of a tour. The geography of North America, let me straighten this out, is very conducive to severe weather. That's why you have warm, moist soars here. You have a barrier in the Rockies. You have very flat land here. And then, of course, you have the cold air coming down from Canada. And this is Tornado Alley. And so it's one of those unique quirks of geography that you really only find in North America. You don't really find it anywhere else. And that's why 95% of all tornadoes in the world occur in the United States and in Canada. All right. So that is the Google Earth tour. Now let's look at the presentation itself. So North America, here's an image of course, New York City. It's very sort of indicative of North America. Yes, the United States, but just North America in general. Why first North America? Well, it's where we happen to be. So if we lived in a different region, then we'd probably begin with that region. That's basically why the book sets it up as it is. You begin with what is most known, most comfortable, easiest to understand. Some of the key concepts for the lesson, and these are the boundaries: Canada, the United States. It's a very highly mobile, industrialized, and urbanized region. There is stress, economic strength in the region, despite not only the 8 to 10 recession, but also a lot of the COVID imposed economic stress that took place in 2020. Again, already went through this on Google Earth. Modifying the environment. Let's think back to something that happened a while ago already, but still significant: Hurricane Katrina, and how it impacted an entire city as a function of where that city was initially set. The French basically picked this region, and this region is largely below sea level. Therefore, when a lot of the levees breached in New Orleans, the city flooded. And so the recovery was slow. It has since recovered significantly, housing prices, and all that. But there's been a lot of disparity in the recovery depending on what part of the city you're from. Here are some of the environmental issues. Um, One of the few areas of the world where deforestation is really not a big problem. I mean, it's not immune to deforestation, but it isn't as significant. So, in this area, you're talking about the idea of water and water stress. That's becoming a big factor out west: California, Oregon, Washington, um, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, as a lot of the population from the Northeast moves out west because of migration and other such patterns. These areas are becoming more water stressed over time. And that water stress isn't just people, it's also agriculture, because agriculture is largely responsible for the majority of water consumption. This image here is a static image from 2021, but it could apply to something in the next few years, or it could apply to something in the back, like 2017, 2015, and before that. This area is constantly subject to drought, constantly subject to water stress and water restrictions. And as a result, um, it's having a significant impact on the economy and on how the area is managed and governed by governors in Nevada and California and Arizona and Oregon. This is Lake Oroville in California. It's become the poster child for water woes, not only in California, but the West Coast. This is what it looks like when the lake is full. This is what it looks like as of June 2021 or July 2021. So low that the ability of the area to generate hydroelectric power has been shut off temporarily. And by the time you read this and watch this, it could be back online, but I doubt it. So that's significant because that's clean energy that's not really being generated as a result of this really low water level. Hoover Dam. This is what Hoover Dam, what the site looked like in 1904. Of course, that's Hoover Dam today. It is probably it's one of the most iconic dams in the world, definitely in the United States. And as you can see, there's a lot of hydroelectric generation that takes place. However, Hoover Dam is at its lowest point ever as of 2021. That means the lowest point since it was built and finished in the early 1930s. Over 150 feet, the water level has dropped. I lived in Las Vegas in 1991, And when I lived there, I visited Hoover Dam many times, and I never ever saw this. It was full to the top. So that gives you a sense of what that's so much water that isn't available for people to consume. So this affects cities of Las Vegas, a lot of Arizona, and Southern California. So we'll begin. We'll talk about human environment interactions and what is the cost of human modification. Whether it's air quality, climate change, acid rain, and other such events. Remember, last time we talked about the fact that systems are connected, and that connectivity between systems and regions has an impact across regions. Regions, we think of them as individual little places, but in reality, they're all connected. And so oftentimes it's difficult for people to sort of get that. Here's an example: pollution. It's not as bad as it used to be in Southern California, namely Los Angeles, but it can still be an issue. You still find this kind of pollution in places like Mexico City, a city of 20 plus million people, and Santiago in Chile, simply because of the terrain, the industry, and the amount of pollution that's expelled by industry, cars, businesses, and so on. Here's an example of the human impact on landscapes and ecosystems. And this would be after the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a wave breaking on the beach that's full of oil. And that oil, while oil is natural, it is normally consumed by bacteria very, very slowly. But when so much of it is dumped, nature can't keep up with it, essentially. And here's New Orleans, Mississippi River Delta. This is where the leaking well was. And this is the sheen that the oil basically produced atop the Gulf of Mexico. Again, look at some of the diversity in physical settings. We'll talk about the idea of climate. Many, many climates are found within the US and Canada, from pine needle forest called boreal forest to prairie, the middle of the United States and Canada, to tundra, to even tropical climates like at the very, very southern end of Florida. So in Florida is the only place in North America that you find an A climate. That's it. Just the southern tip of Florida sticks down the um, into the Caribbean. Otherwise, you have the majority of C climates and D climates in the east and middle, and then B climates in the west, meaning dry. And this is part of the reason why you tend to have water stress. Once you get into Canada, it is essentially D climates, which are called severe mid latitude or high latitude, rather, climates. They're more continental, they're colder, obviously. And then once you get north of that, you get into the ET or tundra climate, which is an area that it's cold enough that you have some moss and grass and lichens, but it's too cold for tree roots to establish. So you don't have any of those. It's very sort of barren. Here's the idea of climate change, a glacier then and now, and how it's evolved over time. And why do we care about climate change? What does it mean? Well, in any city, any coastal city, from the developed world to the developing world, it means sea level rise, basically. It's what that means. And not only does it affect the climate, whether it's hotter, drier, rainier, or whatever, but it also increases sea level. And that has an impact because cities have been established uh, along coastlines, the coastlines that we know now. Here's a change in ecosystem, same location, about two generations apart. So a single human during his or her lifetime could have observed this change. Energy consumption in the US and Canada, we're getting really good at switching away from coal, natural gas, and petroleum and getting more and more. This is already a pretty dated image. The nuclear, hydro, geothermal, and wind, solar is definitely getting larger. And that's a good thing. Population. So the distribution of people in the US from this image and Canada is definitely uneven. In Canada, the majority of people live within about 25 miles of the US border. In the United States, the majority of people live on a line from about San Antonio, Dallas, Oklahoma City, KC, Minneapolis east. In the West, it's a lot more sparse, and the majority of the population clusters are found along the West Coast cities of Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, and San Diego, with a lot of empty or sparsely populated space in that inner mountain west region. In the United States and in Canada, European settlement, you can think of it in stages: the first stage, the second, and the third. And a lot of it basically depended on whatever region of Europe, whether it be Western Europe, Eastern Europe, eventually other places like Asia and Latin America more recently. So the migration has continued to happen west, and that continues to this day. In 2020, the census that was taken surely showed for the first time in a very long time, California actually lost population. Um, States like Texas and Florida and South Carolina and Arizona gained population. States out east either remained flat or lost a little bit of population. So this is the idea of population in the US and Canada. Fertility rate or below replacement level of 2.1, and population continues to decrease or slow down in its sort of we're no longer a fast growing area of the world, and we're definitely getting older. So these are the population pyramids for Canada in 1995, 2020, and 2050. And as you can see, the population bulge is moving upward, meaning all places are getting older. So this is Canada and the US. So if you look at Canada at 2050 and the US at 2050, it's roughly a similar pattern, meaning fewer people in the younger cohorts and more people in the older cohorts. Um, in 1995, you could still see sort of the baby boom generation as they begin to move up in age and eventually die out towards the end. So that's the United States, and this is Canada. Roughly a similar pattern, but Canada is about a generation ahead in terms of its demographic transition. American city usually will we tend to be a more sort of inner city or central city with suburbs surrounding it. Here's an example: the city of Indianapolis, Indiana. Typical core in the middle with interstates surrounding it and some kind of loop that goes around it. And these tend to basically generate what are called edge cities, cities that form around the edge of a larger city, yet are not part of that large city itself. In the United States, we basically invented the term gentrification. It started in New York, and it's the idea of taking an old, dilapidated area and sort of reinventing it. with restaurants and shops. And some people think of it as urban removal, meaning you're essentially removing the people that were there originally and replacing them with younger, more upwardly mobile individuals. So it has kind of a negative and a positive connotation depending how you view it. Look at New York City, 1985, X rated theaters everywhere. It was really a very unpleasant place to be. I remember, this is the New York City I remember as a child. It was nasty, filthy, kind of disgusting. Times Square today is full of big screen jumbotrons and stores and fun shops and street actors and that kind of thing. It's a very, very different, reinvented space. The whole New York City basically has been reinvented. So, and a lot of the changes have been, frankly, quite positive. The COVID effect. So, many argue that COVID has led to a massive exodus away from cities. And the reality is that really mostly happened in New York and San Francisco, where they saw the biggest changes. Many of the changes were happening before COVID ever started. And the moves depend on many individual personal reasons. So that means not everyone can make that move. Think about a lot of the jobs that people were commuting into New York City for that are suddenly, you can suddenly do them from the comfort of your home. And that's changed the way business happens nowadays. The source here being the Bloomberg article 2021. And in green, you see cities that lost and cities that gained. In reality, while New York City lost, most people didn't go really far. They went either to New Jersey, Connecticut, or southern New York, like the Hudson Valley. And so Orange County, Putnam County, counties to the north of New York City or in New Jersey. So a lot of those places saw significant increases in real estate sales, and people were able to actually make a significant amount of money selling their homes because people from cities where prices tend to be higher could afford it. Same thing happened in San Francisco, people moving out of the city into places like Stockton, California, and the Central Valley and south of the city, where they can work on technology like Silicon Valley types, but they can do it from home. So it's been an interesting geographical experiment and thing to witness. For example, here is the COVID effect in terms of net flow in or out of the region. And notice how even before COVID, New York City was losing some people. But as soon as that happened, it became a bit more of a significant impact into early 2021. So again, the population shift was happening before COVID hit the news and it became a thing that everybody paid attention to. And many people argue, hey, I can do my job remotely. Um, why can't I have a home office? I can do all my work from home. I can meet all my deadlines. I can do everything I do in the office, but from home. I don't have to spend money on commutes. I don't have to spend money on trains. I don't have to get up as early. I mean, it's significant and very attractive to a lot of people. And it's frankly attractive to a lot of companies that don't have to host an office anymore. Now, that doesn't work for every business, obviously, but it works for many businesses. And maybe you're part of that move. Maybe you will be part of that sort of like change and shift away in the job market. And while this is not a uniquely American issue, but I think has been more starkly seen in the United States and probably Canada to a lesser effect. Talk about the rural angle of things and the idea of the projection of people. So this is in 2010, percentage white, Hispanic, Black, Native American, Asian, Pacific. Notice how the numbers shift away from one. And frankly, the largest or fastest rising sector is Hispanic in the United States. So people of Hispanic background. Notice how African and Black doesn't really change that much. This increases, it doubles essentially, and this decreases by a significant percentage, 2030 to 2050. This is going back to that whole idea of US historic and current ethnic flows. Notice many of you may have backgrounds from England or Scotland or Norway or whatever. Your family would have come into the United States in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. If your history is more Italian, Spanish, Greek, Eastern European, you're talking about the early 1900s. If your background is more Asian or Latin American, you're talking about the 1960s and beyond. And that's basically what's happening in the United States right now. Picking one location, the idea of Vancouver, where are people coming into Vancouver from? And not surprisingly, the majority of the people there are coming from Asia. And you see that in cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, LA, San Diego. They all have what are called, instead of a little Italy, they have a little Korea, a little Japan, Chinatowns, areas where people tend to concentrate that are from the same or similar background. Lesser to a lesser extent, Europeans or Africans. And here's an example. Again, kind of a bit dated, I fully admit. But for example, where the Hispanic and Asian populations are dominant, no big surprise. Asian populations are dominant in California and New York, whereas Hispanic populations by state are dominant in California, Mexican, Texas, Mexican, Florida, Cuban, and Puerto Rican. And then when you look at New York, you're dealing primarily with Puerto Rican, Dominican, and to a lesser degree, South American. So it really depends. If you're from Texas, the majority of Latin American or Hispanic background people are clearly Mexican because it shares a border with Mexico. Same thing with California, Arizona, and of course, New Mexico. Um, Asia or Asian populations by state tend to be dominant in California. Notice uh, Washington State, Hawaii. I'm surprised Oregon isn't on this list. But in other words, California, because you have cities like San Francisco, Sacramento, San Diego, Los Angeles, each with significant Asian clusters. All right, let's look at the idea of globalization of culture. Um, North America, namely the United States, or specifically the United States, we tend to export a lot of our culture away from us. And this is why you can go to many parts of the world and see so many things that are American in origin. Businesses, Starbucks, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, clothing, technology. So that's the idea of globalizing culture and diffusing that culture. It's also a two-way process. Think about TikTok, that most, I think, annoying of platforms, but it's super popular. Where did TikTok originate? In China. So, unlike Twitter and Facebook and Instagram that are sort of American created, something like TikTok is Asia generated. It just happens to have caught on in the United States. Maybe because of the name, I don't know. So those are the idea of global diffusion of culture. Think about Uggs, those ugliest of shoes. Where do they come from? And they are super popular, but they're Australian. And so if you buy a real brand name pair of Uggs, I mean, you can pay upwards of $150 or more, depending on what type you get. And so that originated out in Australia. Many brands, think about fancy, Dior and Cartier and other such Hermes, uh, European, French, Milan, Paris, London, right? It's all the idea of diffusing culture and fashion, and a lot of these things are sort of shared between regions. Let's see. Talk about geopolitical issues. Many of these remain. Um, we'll talk more about these idea of the wall being built along the south border, even with a different administration in power now. I mean, Texas is sort of planning on building it anyway. There is a wall. There always has been a wall. I think people don't quite get that. There has been a wall for generations. Um, and so that's a geopolitical challenge. That is a challenge to the idea of sovereignty. So the United States is a sovereign country, so is Canada. Many people argue for no borders. Many people argue for more borders. Think of the idea of Quebec. Quebec is the center of French Canadian culture in Canada, yet the rest of Canada is more British Canada. So Canada has this sort of duality to it. And so that's a challenge to federalism, which is sort of looking at the country in its entirety. Let's see. These are some of the human, um, economic, and social development aspects. It is the Human Development Index, which is something that's developed to assess a country's health, economic and social and geopolitical health, as a function of education, life expectancy, income, and in many instances, the idea of gender equality or inequality, however you want to view it. So think about the idea of how much people make per person versus life expectancy, male, female, and gender equality or inequality. In the end, you come up with a number. The closer you are to one, the better. In the United States and Canada, we're pretty close to one another. That's a very good score. The highest score is Norway at 0.94. So they're considered the most developed country in the world, combining things like education, life expectancy, income, and the idea of the role of women in that particular society. So I will leave it at that. Lots of stuff to talk about. It's a relatively straightforward region as we get into different regions. So next week we look into Latin America and then the Caribbean before moving on to the other side of the world. But each region has its own set of challenges that are very, very different from the region before or the region after. If you have any questions, please come to the live office hour or send me an email and we'll set one up for you that meets your schedule. Otherwise, best of luck and have a great week.